stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, to connect. What we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. When you figure out which stories to share, difficult bosses and coworkers, successes, failures, the next step is to develop how you share them. Have you figured out your patterns, your roles in those successes, the discomfort and your challenges? In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you. You'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into the lessons from each of those. How many times have you been sharing a story only to be interrupted by a person eager to share his own? When I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, not to respond. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your own related stories, to listen and consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. Valerie, thank you so much for joining me today on this episode of Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will.
Thank you for having me.
I just want to start with the really basics, which is that we met on LinkedIn. And for our listeners, this is Valerie Gordon. She has a company called Commander and She. And we connected via LinkedIn. And I'll let her describe how we met because I think it was pretty entertaining. And I would rather hear it from your perspective anyway.
I wish I could recall how I first found you on LinkedIn. It must have been some sort of a mutual connection because you showed up in my feed. And I thought, here's a woman who knows storytelling and is doing storytelling really well. And you're very generous in the sharing of your content. And so the more I kind of followed you and learned about you, I became somewhat enamored and I hope politely stalked you a little bit in sending a message just to connect and say, hey, fellow storyteller here. And I would love to find out what you're doing with storytelling and how you're using it, because I'm so fascinated by the many different ways that it can be used. And then we had that great phone call. And when you just feel a kinship with someone, it's like, I get her. And I love her love of stories and that you're sharing so many stories on your podcast. So thank you for connecting with me and for allowing me to share some stories with you today.
Well, thank you. I like to think of it in terms of that first conversation, actually, when you personalized your connection request, because I get hundreds of requests, and to see one that actually said, I love what you're doing with storytelling. This is what I'm doing with it, and I'd love to connect and learn more. That to me just stood out beyond anything else. So thank you first for personalizing that connection request, but also just for reaching out the way you did and having that first phone call, because you're right. Sometimes you just know. Mm-hmm. So let's jump in with the first question that I always ask guests, which is, I would love it if you would just share something about yourself that most people might not know about you.
So people who know me today as an adult probably or might not know that I grew up with a chess prodigy older brother who was one of these kids who just could look at a board and figure out every potential combination of moves that could conceivably come thereafter. And by the time I was in junior high, he's a few years older, he was traveling around the country and to the former Soviet Union and coming home with these trophies that were bigger than me. And I am not a chess player. I do not share this talent with him. And I recall as a kid feeling like, well, gosh, I'm supposed to find my thing that I'm really good at and get these giant trophies. And I believe that you're supposed to be really good at one thing. And I would try all these different things that I was good at, but not the best at. And so two things came out of that. One was I felt like I was on this very long search for a long time of like, what is my thing that I'm supposed to be the best at? And the second was somewhere along the line, I think I got the message that, well, you may not be the smartest person in the room or the most talented person in the room, but you can outwork anyone. And I think there's some good part of that message that helps someone develop a strong work ethic. But that strong work ethic became something that I realized was no longer sustainable after doing it for many, many years, which I know is something that we'll talk about today. And that search for that elusive trophy helped me realize as an adult, now I have this insatiable curiosity for what else might I like to do? And this desire to be the best at something is really replaced with this idea of, I do think it's better to be good or interested in so many different things than just have that one thing that defines you or that one purpose. And the idea that your purpose can change over time is also something that I'm really interested in helping women pursue in their careers and in their personal lives. So that stemmed from the giant trophies of my childhood and wanting one of my own. And it's a little less important, I think, as you grow up.
I appreciate that story for so many reasons. I mean, the first thing is to be the younger sibling of somebody who finds their one thing and does it beautifully well. And so my older brother was a singer and actor in high school, and he played the leads in Dracula and Hamlet. And I was told not to even try out for any acting spots in any of our shows. I sang in many performances, but I was told in no uncertain terms that if I auditioned for any acting roles, I was unlikely to get them. And I remember having that similar feeling of, well, wait a minute, what am I really good at? And I love the idea of that sense of curiosity being part of what you're really good at. And it leads me right into this whole other idea of kind of feeling sad for your brother in a way, because there's this point where you start getting defined by these things, and it makes it really hard to get out of that. And I tell people there are lots of things that you may be very good at that you don't necessarily like to do. But if you're defined by that, especially on a global scale like your brother was, trying to get out of that or establish yourself in any other way, we all know can be really, really hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see it a lot in business these days with people pigeonholing people or siloing them. You're seen a certain way. And it's one of the reasons why I like to approach career development as, think about it as chapters of a book. And what's your next chapter? And what I'm really finding is a number of people, most of my clients are women, but a number of people, particularly even at mid-age, of just starting to ask that question again of what do I want to be when I grow up? And having this whole second chapter or second act or just another next chapter in you. And the things that, maybe you don't explore as much as a child because you feel like you have to get on a path to somewhere, and reestablishing that sense of curiosity as an adult of, I never really tried that, or I never knew I liked that, or you know what, I've always done this and I don't like it. And being able to add to your own personal story that way with the parts of you that maybe you've yet to discover.
And there's so much of that. I find it kind of sad and interesting at the same time when I talk to a coaching client that I'm just starting with, and I say something about my love for ceramic arts and how I had studio space in a co-op for 13 years and the singing in different bands, and I used to do calligraphy, and I was a compliance officer for a federal grant, and I have an MBA, and they all look at me like they're so puzzled, and for some reason this seems, I don't know, eccentric to people that I explore all of these things, and I call it impulsive. But it's that curiosity of, if I don't try it, I don't know if I'm good at it or if I'm going to enjoy it.
Right. I love that. And I love that completes like the whole of who you are. And it goes along also with your catchphrase of your stories don't define you, how you tell them will. It's also your labels don't define you, how you add to them or recreate them will as well. And I do believe that in every person there is an even better next chapter. So for anyone maybe who's feeling a little stuck or mislabeled, or like you've been filling a role that just isn't you, I think we would probably both agree just to turn the page with a little curiosity about what you might discover about yourself.
A lot of curiosity. That's my favorite word. If that's the one word that people use to describe somebody, when I hear somebody say, "Oh, she's just so curious," I'm immediately intrigued. I want to know her. That's just the best word. This is a perfect kind of segue into our theme today, which is the series that I've been working through with my guests in the last few weeks has been a series on resilience. And as we have kind of talked about before, our first guest really talked about the physical resilience of survival, especially when it comes to a likely fatal diagnosis of cancer in her case. And her sense of resilience really came from her sense of responsibility to the people in her life. She didn't want to let anyone down. And so she fought it. And she didn't just fight it, she fought it with this positive attitude that not only was she going to be around, but that she could live with this and still be happy and still find joy. And then my next guest, Charlotte, was really talking in terms of the resilience that we build through our experiences, being able to tell a story where we thrived through adversity and keeping that in the back of our head as our evidence that we can do it again, which I love, of course. And then my more recent guest, Amber, talked about resilience as a sense of self in terms of choosing to live a life she wants as opposed to just surviving, that she wants to enjoy every little bit of the life that she has in her, whether she's alone or in a group. And that was a fascinating conversation because it was a totally different take on where she finds her resilience. So one of the things that totally intrigued me about our conversation was when you talked about the unlikelies, those aspects of our life that we don't see as being pivot points at the time, that actually really convert to what I would call an attitude of resilience. And just as a reminder for our listeners, resilience, it has a really simple definition of being able to come back, to bounce back to where you were before. But to me, resilience has so much more to do with choosing not just to survive something, but to thrive because of it or in spite of it or learning lessons from it.
Right. And that's very much what the unlikelies are. The unlikelies are elements of our lives that we don't like. That's why they're called the unlikelies. And also that we don't believe are likely to help us. So there's 4 that I have in mind that I want to talk through. But I'd like to tell a little story first about discovering resilience and really what happened to me and how I learned to be resilient in the face of what was really a great disappointment. So my background is as a television producer. I spent more than 20 years in media working for major networks, sports and news. And I had this great job. I had this great career where I was putting stories on TV. I was telling feature stories that made people laugh and cry and cheer. And I loved it for many years. And I worked very, very hard at it. Again, that early work ethic about you can outwork anyone. And I did that. I worked all the time. And even after having 2 kids, I wanted to prove that I could still do it and I wouldn't miss a beat. And I worked and I worked and I worked. And I worked myself into a state of burnout that I didn't even realize at the time was happening. I knew I was tired, physically, mentally tired, but I was so stubborn that the only thing I knew to do was to keep working through it, which is, now looking back on it, there were clues and I should have slowed down. And but I think it was supposed to happen. It was one of those unlikely and bad circumstances that at its worst left me lying on the floor in my closet crying to the dog because this was not the way the story was supposed to go. I thought I'd be, running a network. I thought I would be managing the whole work-life balance thing. I thought I would be happy. And the fact of the matter was I had this great life and I wasn't enjoying it. And it was a really low moment just thinking like, well, this was not how it was supposed to turn out. And that's when I realized, well, this is not how the story was supposed to go, but this is also not how the story ends. So this state of burnout, which I eventually wrote about in an article on LinkedIn called The Beauty of Burnout, really forced me to look at, well, what do you want? If this isn't working for you, what do you want? And that was not an overnight process. It took a long time to really think it through. And by the way, burnout is a terrible state to be in, and it can take a really long time to recover from it. But ultimately, it was a good thing because had I not gone through that state of such exhaustion, I don't think I would have changed anything or approached anything with curiosity. And I certainly would not have had the need and desire to pivot my career. So I wound up ultimately leaving the media industry, leaving television, and opening my own company called Commander in She, where I use storytelling to help with clients, but largely women, focused largely on women's experience in the corporate world, to help women better use their stories for career advancement. And I love it. I love what I'm doing now. And none of that would have happened had I not been forced into what was a really dismal situation. So when I think of resilience, I think it's messy. I think it's ongoing. I think it's your story is not over. When I think of resilience, I think of recreation. This is what we know. This is what happened. This is what's going on. What are we going to do with that information? And how do we move on in our story? So as part of the workshops I do, I do an entire, facilitate an entire session on the unlikelies. And I can talk you through them, starting with one that you probably know is a great story element. And in fact, it's a necessary story element for any great story, but no one likes it in their own life. It's conflict. Mm-hmm. Because I tell everyone, you've never read, seen, watched, or heard a story, a good story, that doesn't have some sense of conflict in it. Conflict is a story driver. Yeah. And yet
otherwise there isn't a story.
There's no story. Yeah,
what's the story if there's not some conflict?
There's no stakes. Yeah.
Right.
So, but in our own lives, I mean, who likes conflict? We hate conflict. So conflict is an unlikely story element because while we think it's unlikely to help us, it shows us that there's stakes at play and that whatever is happening is important to us. Mm-hmm. And that we are in the driver's seat to make a decision in the face of that conflict to make that story our own, to drive that story forward. So that's my first unlikely. Wondering if you have any other thoughts about the role conflict plays in the stories of our own lives.
It's funny. I think people not underestimate. They don't see conflict where conflict is sometimes. And in some cases, it's really sad that it takes to getting to the bottom before you start to realize that you're unhappy. Back to your original story of you're in the closet crying to your dog. Isn't it sad that we have to get to that point to make a change? But we all know that that's usually the case. But if we're looking at conflict as an unlikely, the things that you really don't like, it doesn't have to be terrifying. It doesn't have to be horrible. A conflict could be as simple as you choose to try to get pregnant, and that time in your life, especially if it doesn't happen right away, that could be one part of it. Or if we see conflict in terms of, I like to talk about my 3 Band-Aids, which means I tell my friends, if I have 3 Band-Aids on my hands, it means that I'm not fully present. And if I get a 4th one, the 4th one could be a car accident or something much more serious than a Band-Aid on my fingers. And so for me, just even getting to the point where I have 3 Band-Aids on my hands, that's enough of a conflict for me to stop what I'm doing and think, okay, am I using my time wisely? Am I finding satisfaction meaning in the ways that I'm spending my time? So that's the only addition I would say, is that conflict doesn't have to be huge. You don't have to end up on the floor in tears or in a car accident or a diagnosis to have a conflict. Even what somebody else may see is a minor detail of your life, it's all relative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I agree with that. Conflicts can come in all shapes and sizes. And what I do think is for people who find that they kind of keep winding up in the same conflict over and over again.
Yes.
It's because they've not yet addressed it. If you're having a challenge with a coworker or, a certain type of relationship, why do these things keep happening to me? Well, that's a clue, right?
You might be contributing. You're the common factor.
Yes. And you
Right.
haven't yet made the choice in the face of that conflict that's going to move your story along. And what I find interesting is that most people would rather stay in a state of conflict, let's say a small conflict, then make a choice to move on from it, because sometimes what they don't know, they'd rather stay in something that they know, even if it's making them unhappy, than move on from it to what they don't know. And that's where, to me, conflict is just a really interesting clue. What do I want to do with this information, this conflict in my life? And what are the choices I have in the face of this conflict? And we know if we want to change the ending of the story or move along in our story, we have to choose something different than what we've done in the past.
Yes. Choose your own adventure books.
Exactly. So I really love, I love conflict as a personal storytelling device, and as one of those clues. My second unlikely is another clue, and it is dissatisfaction. So dissatisfaction, I say, is actually a great thing. It's a great thing in our lives. It's one of those unlikelies that we don't like and we believe is unlikely to help us. And yet when you think about what you are dissatisfied about, it's a great motivator. It's something that calls for action, that calls for change. So whether you're dissatisfied with your salary, or the state of your relationship, or that you can't zip up your pants, from that dissatisfaction, we can then make choices and create the plot points necessary to move past it. So I actually think dissatisfaction is a great thing to explore where you're not satisfied. And we use that dissatisfaction to make changes, to reach a state of satisfaction. And then when that changes and we're no longer satisfied, well, then we can keep changing up the plot and moving the story forwards. But I think in some ways, dissatisfaction is actually a really good thing
I totally agree. Totally agree. Stories. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said you find your satisfaction and then something else pops up. When I'm working with a coaching client, I recommend that we go through kind of an assessment, a satisfaction assessment, regularly. Like every year, I'll go through my little satisfaction assessment. Am I satisfied with where I am right now? Am I satisfied with the direction I'm headed right now? If yes, great. If no, what can I do starting tomorrow to change that?
I love it. It's a very active response to sort of that dissatisfaction. And I don't know if you meet in your line of work people who it almost seems like they'd like to stay dissatisfied. They'd rather stay in that area where they can just sort of mope and complain about it rather than actively author what's going to happen next. Do you have any tips on how to help people who like to stay in that state?
Well, I actually have two scenarios with that. And one is for people who are like that, many times the equation comfort equals happiness works. And if that's where they find comfort and they find that they're happy to whatever extent that looks like to them, my baseline is happy, so I know what it looks like. But for some people, comfort equals happiness. And if that's where they are in their lives, then I can't tell them to change that. So I think about that a lot because that does not work for me. That equation has never worked for me. But there are people who they really don't like transition, which is conflict, and it's also dissatisfaction. And so the way that I describe it is that many people, their lives are mostly comfort and then short transition, then mostly comfort, then a short transition. Mine is the opposite. I'm in mostly transition, then a short time of comfort, then mostly transition. I live in that place. So I have a hard time. I don't have a hard time. I have to take a step back when I see people where that equation works, because I think it's important for us to understand that there are people like that. But as far as people who are remaining that position because they don't know what else is out there and they're afraid, I always suggest they think in terms of what are the activities, the daily activities that bring them satisfaction. Like I'll actually have them talk about, and it's hard sometimes if they're in a dark place, but we can find something like kissing your son goodbye before he goes to school. I find great satisfaction in that. And we can unpack that. Why do I find satisfaction in that? Well, I find satisfaction in it because I know that I have a good relationship with him, that he'll still kiss me. He's 17 years old and he'll still kiss me goodbye. So if you start with something small and you prime your brain to look for those things, then you can start understanding your patterns and why you're finding that dissatisfaction. Does that kind of answer what you were asking me?
It does. It does. And I love that exercise. And I do something similar where I have people list, groups list of things that they do on a daily basis. And then things they wish they could do on a daily basis. And I don't mean like jumping on a plane to Hawaii, but, things that they just enjoy. And then how do we move some of those things from that second column? How do we make time for them in that first column? What are those small things that will bring you a greater sense of satisfaction? And that's where it starts. But I love the idea of identifying the dissatisfaction and deciding what you're going to do with it. Because change is inevitable. I mean, I think people fear change, but it's going to happen at some point, whether you want it to or not. And I think that you and I are both the kind of people that we'd rather be in charge of that change. We'd rather be leading the change than waiting to see what happens. And that to me is the whole idea of actively authoring your life is being on the front end of that change rather than waiting for someone to tell you what happens next, which is my third unlikely, which is uncertainty. Nobody likes uncertainty. Nobody likes it when things are ambiguous. And we certainly don't think that that's something that is likely to help us. But the great thing about uncertainty is that nothing is ordained. Nothing is pre-written. Your life story is not, you might have certain circumstances that have put you, and your past choices have created your present, but it's really your present choices and actions that are going to create your future. And so when people are worried about, well, I don't know what's going to happen at work, or I don't know if I'm going to be able to have that baby, or I don't know if I should take this job or if this relationship is going to work out, I think that uncertainty is a terrific story element because it puts you in the driver's seat of what do I want to do with this? And how do I take charge of it? Because to a certain extent, we can create what comes next. If there were certainty in everything, yes, we might know the outcome, but we might not like it, or someone else might be deciding for us. So I think uncertainty is another one of those terrific unlikelies for anyone feeling it to know that, well, it's just, you're starting with a blank page. What do you want to put on it? What are you going to write?
It's funny you say that because I had a podcast recording with Marilyn Delbourg-Delphis, who is an IT person. Her claim to fame is that when she started her first Silicon Valley company, she's French and she moved to the US and started her first company, and she poached Guy Kawasaki from Apple as her first employee. And that was one of the keys that we talked about was uncertainty and the fact that life is uncertain. And if you have the foundation to deal with that, to know that whatever happens, I'm going to be okay, then that uncertainty does become a tool that you can use, which is, I think, where you're going with this, to start rewriting your story because you don't know, as opposed to being fearful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you just said really speaks to the resilience that you trust yourself enough to know that whatever happens, you can get through it. And the fourth unlikely that I have here is something that turns a lot of people green, and it is envy. And so how is envy a good thing? How is it one of those things that actually could help us? Well, I tell people it points out to you things that you might want or desire. And when you're feeling envious of something, well, consider why. What makes that important to you? Like, I know for me, one of my goals for last year that I didn't complete, that's on the goal list for this year, is to finish my first book. And I'm struggling with it, as a lot of first-time writers are. And whenever I hear that someone else is publishing a book, I get that feeling of horrible, horrible envy. Now, that person has put in all the work and deserves to have their book published. And I've taken that to mean that it's not really them I'm envious of. I want what they have, and I want the discipline in myself to be able to complete it. So envy to me is a clue of this is important to me, and I need to spend time on it because otherwise it's going to keep bothering me to hear that someone else has done it. Now, someone did ask me, well, look, but sometimes aren't we envious of what we perceive someone's life to be? Like on social media, we see a picture and we think we're envious of something, but that's not actually their reality. And I don't think it matters because what we're envious of is this idea. So if you're envious of, your friend who's always traveling somewhere exotic, Well, think about what that means to you, because do you feel too stagnant? Do you feel you have too many responsibilities to just pack up and go somewhere? If you're envious of someone who is very fit, and maybe they're not, maybe it's great lighting and it's just, how they post things. It doesn't matter. It's what it means to you when you consider why you are envious of it. So these 4 unlikelies, and there are others, but these are the main 4 that I really dug into when I had that case of that burnout, that state of conflict and dissatisfaction and uncertainty and envy of people who weren't going through that. I had to take those 4 elements and say, what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with it now? Mm-hmm. And it reminds me of a quote that I wanted to share from the author C.S. Lewis. That you
one of my favorites.
Yes, and so many good quotes. So I'm sure you've heard this one before. You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending. And I just love the idea. My approach to storytelling is very much that we are active authors of our own career success and happiness. And it's up to us to decide what happens next.
I never thought of envy that way, but you're exactly right. And on the other side of that same coin would be spite. Mm-hmm. Those can both be really powerful motivators if you are using them well, if you're using them to better yourself. And I know that sounds weird that you're doing something to spite someone else to benefit yourself, but it's true. When I worked with teenage girls, I had 2 that I spent a lot of time with when my kids were younger. And one of them would come over and she'd cry to me that none of her teachers thought she was going to amount to anything. And she would tell me these horrible things that some adults would say to this 13-year-old girl, horrible things. And whether they said them in exactly the way she repeated them didn't even matter, because that's how she heard them. That's how she was perceiving those words. Mm-hmm. And I would say to her, what are you going to do about that? What do you want from your life? Do you want to do something else, or do you want to be the person that they're describing? And that could be a really powerful motivator. And I'm so glad you said envy, because I'm immediately triggered to some of the things, the book writing, when another one of my friends just published a book and I'm like, oh, it's my turn. When is it my turn? And as much as I love her and I'm so excited for this woman who just published this book, at the same time, I'm like, that little green-eyed monster is definitely popping its face in. And you're right, it does motivate me, but it's clearly not motivating me enough. So I need to look into this and really try to associate action with that envy.
And that's the next step. But to me, that's very much, first of all, it's a natural human emotion. I think we beat ourselves up so much when we feel it because we feel like it's mean-spirited, or, you mentioned spite, but you're absolutely right. Some of these things can be used in positive ways. So I think the first is to accept that we're feeling it and then use it as a clue. Well, why am I feeling this way? What is it telling me that's important to me? And then what are the actions that I can take to move the plot forward? When I work with my clients, when I run my workshops, I focus on the 3 main story elements, because I say every story has to have these 3 things. Character, you are the central character of your own story. Plot, something is happening in your story. And the great thing about plot is that we can make things happen. We also have to learn how to deal with plot twists when things don't go according to plan. Yes. And the third is that narrative point of view, sort of that voice of the story. Who is your narrator and what are they telling you? And if you are feeling things like dissatisfaction or envy or uncertainty, you can choose to look at it as a really bad thing. Or you can do what we're doing here and having this conversation about the unlikelies, that they are unlikely elements that actually really help us in our own stories.
And, I'd like to add one more, because of something that I've seen a lot that I don't experience a lot is regret. And regret doesn't have to be the end of the story.
Right.
And I think that's where people get stuck, is they get to this point where even in their 50s or 60s, they look back with regret. And I think it's so important to consider where you are in that moment and what you regret, and then consider where you want to be in 5 years looking back. Are we going to have the same conversation in 5 years? all those same regrets. You wanted to start this business, you wanted to do this and that, you regret not having done it last year or in the previous 5 years. But are we going to have the same conversation in 5 years?
Right.
And just, acknowledging that and talking to people in that way, like, okay, that's fine. Do you want a kick in the ass, or would you rather spend another 5 years and then look back and regret even more?
Exactly. I love that you can use it as a motivator. And I would add to that too, that for people who are feeling regret about chances missed, that to remind them that at that time they might have made the right choice, for
Right.
where they were in their lives. But I think where you and I are so much aligned is that, the stories, they're not over. They don't.
Right. Until you stop breathing.
Exactly. The story.
And even then, your legacy lives on.
Your life story lives on. And so what do you want to include in it? But this whole idea of feeling stuck or waiting for something to happen or feeling like you're reading that same chapter over and over again. I say if you're in a particularly bad chapter, well, we got to turn the page. We got to figure out what it is you need to do so that the next chapter doesn't mirror the last one. And at the same time, I tell people, you talked about that comfort, that place of comfort. If you're in a great chapter and things are moving and grooving, by all means, stay there as long as you want until you reach that point where you're dissatisfied and ready to change something, or maybe you're a little bored, or you just want to reach for something new. No one's saying that each chapter has to be the exact same length. But I love the idea that we can use some of these things that show up in our stories in a positive way.
And it definitely comes full circle to resilience. One of the things my friend Amber said was, it's not if, it's when. And like you said, there's going to be a plot twist, and you generally have zero control over it. Whether you get fired or you find a diagnosis or something changes dramatically, it's going to happen at some point. And if you're using these tools, understanding where things are coming from and what your next move is going to be, or at least thinking about it in those terms, what am I learning from this? How can I move to the next chapter? Then you're building that resilience. You're building the potential to come back from something that's going to happen. And I think it's just so important. Kimberly Davis, in her book, Brave Leadership, says that your brave unfolds one situation at a time. Mm-hmm. So you're not going to be resilient and just stay there your whole life. There's always going to be opportunities to explore resilience over and over and over again. Yeah. And I think that's just a really important concept. It's part of what drives us forward. And because whatever the conflict is or whatever the plot is, it's going to change.
And that's what makes, plot twists are what makes stories interesting and also relatable. How often have you talked to someone whose life is just perfect and there is no conflict and everything's wonderful, and either you think she's full of it and she's not giving you the true story, or you just feel like you have nothing in common with her. It's one of the reasons why in storytelling, we root for the hero who has gone through some difficult circumstances to get to where they're going. And so all of these things that are challenges in our lives and that set us back or knock us to our knees are things that make our story really worth telling. So I'm not suggesting anyone go out, and I always worry that people will say, oh, I heard this podcast and this woman told me I need more conflict and dissatisfaction in my life. I don't want you to have more of it.
No, don't go looking for it.
No, but I want you to know what to do with it when you see it and how to use them in better ways.
And also to look back at the stories from your past and be able to see where those patterns were. As you said, somebody who's in the same chapter over and over again, it's Groundhog Day over and over again. And they just don't take the time to see the pattern and to understand their own role in it. So I think your 4 things plus regret, those parts are really such critical components to our personal growth. No matter what they are, no matter how relative they are to somebody else's 5 struggles that we understand to be really great growth potential. And the other thing that I always come back to is struggle isn't the only way to learn lessons. You don't have to. I've heard people say, oh, your most important lessons come from your obstacles and your struggles. And I totally disagree with that. I totally disagree with that. We certainly can learn really important lessons in those struggles if we're open to them.
Yeah.
But we can also learn from a fantastic experience of having a baby, the labor and delivery that actually goes relatively smoothly, which nothing goes perfectly, but relatively smoothly. That can teach us lessons as well. Holding that baby for the first time, the joy that you experience, that sense of gratitude and awe, and I mean awe. You can learn so much from that, just as much as you can learn from devastation.
Absolutely. I think oftentimes people feel like their story isn't big enough. Maybe they haven't gone through the same sort of struggle as someone else. And there's no comparison to be had. I mean, no one should be comparing their struggles. But what I love about the stories that we tell are that it's the really fine details which distinguish us from one another. And by the way, make us relatable, because not everyone has suffered a great tragedy, but we all understand what it's like to drive to work in a rush with our coffee cup on the roof of our car,
Right.
And that becomes a very relatable story. It's not necessarily a struggle. So it's the fine details of our story and how we relate them to our audience that become most memorable.
Totally agree. And I think people forget that it's those things that do go wrong that we remember the most. So I always talk about weddings in that way, that the weddings that go off without a hitch are not nearly as memorable as one that has something that happens, like the cake tumbles off the table. Or in my case, my grandmother was late and we had to start late because she had broken her hip just a few weeks before. And I remember standing at the top of the steps before coming down to get married. And my mom said, "You have to start right now. You have to start right now," because there were people waiting. And I said, "I'm not starting without her." I said, "And you can't start the wedding without the bride." And I remember that so vividly because it was, something that didn't go so smoothly. So I think people, when you talk about those fine details, I think that people really appreciate hearing those particular details more so than, "Oh, it was a beautiful day. Everything went great."
Sure. Well, there's that honesty and authenticity and vulnerability and relatability and in all of that when we're being honest about ourselves and that, what went wrong when it could have gone better. So it's such an important point.
It is. So just briefly before we wrap up, I'd love to know just a little bit more about your business so that our listeners can hear a little bit more about what you do and what you really love to do.
Sure. So I love storytelling. And what I've done is I've taken my background in storytelling with everything that I've learned from what makes a story memorable and meaningful and worthy of putting on television. And I've created a series of workshops to help largely for women in business. But again, I say that storytelling is a gender neutral and universal language. So it's really for anyone. And now I speak at conferences and at corporations through women's leadership programs and affinity groups about how to use the elements of storytelling for our own career success and satisfaction. So that's everything from how we speak of our past stories, our successes in interviewing, networking, negotiation, to how we deal with our present stories, those challenges and conflict, uncertainty, dissatisfaction, all those things that crop up, to envisioning what is the future story? What's the goal setting here? Where are we trying to get to? And I love it because there's a moment when I'm providing these workshops in the room where you can really see that light bulb go off in everyone's head when they realize, I really am in charge of this thing. And it gets them feeling good about who they are and their stories, both the ones that have already taken place to this point, but to the future ones too, that they're looking forward to creating. So this is my new chapter. It is not the final chapter. That much I know. I'm going to continue to approach everything with a sense of curiosity, and we'll see what comes next.
Excellent. That sounds like a great chapter that you're starting to write. And hopefully we'll both start writing those chapters that we've been
in our books,
meaning to write in our books in the very near future. That is so exciting. I love to hear that, partly because I know that we have that in common in terms of we know that where we are right now isn't necessarily where we're going to be in a couple years. And I like to tell people, I know I'm not in denial. I know this is making me happy right now, and that I'm going to make shifts as I move forward, because otherwise I get bored. And what's the point of that?
And that's what keeps the story interesting. And what I love about having connected with you on LinkedIn and now having this relationship from afar is that we can support each other as supporting characters in each other's stories as well. Because while we're the central character of our own story, being a supporting character in someone else's, whether you're a cheerleader or a collaborator or accountability partner, that really adds to your own story as well.
It definitely does. Thank you so much, Valerie. This was really a treat to have this conversation. And I know that we're going to have many more into the future. And for another analogy that I like to use, because I'm a storyteller and I love road trips, I may be driving my car, but I have great company along with me on that road trip.
Well, thank you for having me as part of your company.
Absolutely. I think we have a lot of adventures ahead of us.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?